All right, class. Today we're looking at the Mediterranean as the cradle of the classical world. So, within the confines of ancient Mediterranean history, we're looking at how did we get to the foundations of what comes next. And we're looking at how the ancient world sets the stage for the classical world. So, the classical world is essentially from 600 BC to 680, and we're looking at this setting the stage for that. So some of the big societal kinds of things that come on the scene would just be language and the rise of city-states, which we'll see a little bit later, and interconnectedness among different societies. So different cultures are going to have different aspects that meet one another. So specifically right now what we're going to look at is what is the Mediterranean culture? What's the interaction amongst various different people groups? And for us, what we look at is, perhaps this is a good way to consider it. In this statue, we see several stages of human history set out, at least those stages that are most important to biblical history. So in this case, we see from Daniel chapter 2, a statue that begins with a head of gold, which is representative of Babylon, and then moves down to the breast and arms of silver, which represents Medes and Persians. Belly and thigh would represent Greece. The legs of iron represent Rome. And then finally we see the feet of iron and clay. And one of the ways to look at that last section is the entirety of history of the divided nations of Europe. So when we back up and take a second look at Rome, we have to understand that Rome has two separate and distinct legs, and that's very accurate because in history we see an east and a west. We know that the west ended in the 5th century, but the east was then Constantinople. It continued on for about 1,000 years beyond that. So then when we look at this feet of iron and clay, I'd prefer to see that as representative of that final empire rather than being just throughout history. It represents that last one world government and ultimately the government under Antichrist in the tribulation. Of course, we finally see that there's a stone. This is Christ's kingdom, which will wipe out all the rest of these kingdoms and establish something completely new. So the other place to look at how we understand human history and governments is Revelation 17, 7 through 10, which says, "But the angel said to me, 'Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her.'" So the woman represents this one world religious system that will eventually come about. And the beast is something separate as well. The beast is what carries her. So it's which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. So the beast itself has 7 heads and 10 horns. If we went back here, the other place we look at Daniel is he has 7 beasts lined out representing these same 4 stages, with this final beast being this wild beast that has attributes of all the others, but has the ability to just crush things. So we see that. So the beast that you saw was and is not and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition, and those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Here's the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. So the mountains most commonly in prophetic literature are speaking to kingdoms. So just like in this final mountain, this grows into a mountain, this final kingdom, and that's which the stone comes in and destroys. So these mountains represent a series of kingdoms, and it also describes them as 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue for a short time. So they've all been presented, but then it pauses and says, there's still one to come. And it's going to be around for a little while, but it's not here yet. So here's one commentator says, representative of the 7 great world empires. So there are other world empires that rise up parallel to, say, Egypt or Assyria, say China, for example. However, those empires are not directly impacting biblical history, so there wouldn't be the same kind of concern with them, even though they're great, powerful kingdoms that should be studied and understood as historians, but they're not represented in biblical history. And what we're looking at is specifically biblical history. Here we're looking at Mediterranean history. So we see this as being important. These series of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then from that passage, the final Rome, which is described as Mystery Babylon, is represented as being in Babylon. I think that final empire will have its kingdom in Babylon, the ancient location of that city. So, but for today, we're primarily concerned about history and not eschatology. But I think those two topics, history and eschatology, go hand in hand, because as we study history, we learn more about how to understand what the future holds as well, and how to interpret prophecy. So Plato records this, Socrates saying, the people of this area, the Mediterranean, is who he's talking about, inhabit some small part around the sea, just like ants or frogs around a pond. Now, when you see this phrase, most of the time what you're going to see is just the part about frogs around a pond. We generally cut the rest of that off. So that's important to understand. That's sort of how this region was understood, that this is a giant pond, the Mediterranean Sea, and there's a bunch of frogs around it, and those frogs would have some interaction. They'd be able to hear each other, know what the next one's doing. But it is just a big pond. Now, this big pond has different regions, and I wanted to be aware of that, because you'll hear sometimes some of the phrases. The big ones are the Adriatic Sea, which is located between the eastern coast of Italy and the western Balkan. That's Croatia and such. The Aegean Sea is between Greece and Turkey. And then you'll see the rest of these represented. We'll pull that map back up again and just show you. This is Levantine, so related to Levant, which is this entire area here, Upper Levant, Lower Levant. Here's the Adriatic up here, the Aegean. So you'll hear those phrases. I wanted you to be able to know what they're talking about if those come up either in conversation or literature. So when we're studying the Mediterranean history, we've already started to look at Egypt. So we know Egypt and Mesopotamia are two of the oldest cultures. And when we talk about the Mediterranean, we talk about frogs around a pond. So we're looking at this interconnectiveness within the Mediterranean region. So in ancient history, there were movements of people, there were contacts, there was trade, And the trade would have shared ideas about the past, present, and the future. They would have shared ideas about religion, and they would have shared technology. They would have shared trade items such as pottery. In technology, they would have shared things like weapons of war. They would have shared things like how they produced the goods, and people move in and they start producing wares that maybe are desired in another area but not produced there yet. So we've talked about the Exodus, and we've talked about Egypt in the previous couple weeks, but I want to add this part to it, and that is a conversation about the Hyksos, which is an ethnically mixed group of Western Asiatic Semitic people who overthrew the Egyptian 13th dynasty and formed the 15th to the 16th dynasties. And that, what you're going to see, this is according to Dr. Price. Randall Price takes a specific view. You're going to see different views as far as which dynasties they impacted, but certainly they're gone by the 18th dynasty, 18th, 19th dynasty, reverted back to the original people of Egypt. So these are Semitic people. And what I want to show you is you have this movement back and forth, the Semitic people coming into Egypt, for example, and displacing the original Egyptian, ethnic Egyptians. So this kind of thing takes place all the time. And I just want to have a conversation about a couple of those. Then we're going to look at a couple biblical examples of warfare and how that impacts the region in the ancient world. We're going to look at language and written language specifically. We're going to look at a couple things from there. So the Hyksos in the Table of Nations, the people of Mitzrayim, which is Egypt, are listed as descendants of Ham. Abraham moved to Egypt during a time of famine, according to Genesis 12. Hagar, who bore Ishmael, was an Egyptian. And during the Hyksos period, Joseph was sold into slavery and later rose to the position of second in command in Egypt. He was able to invite his family to dwell in Goshen in the Nile Delta. And their descendants were able to live there peacefully until a new pharaoh or great house arose to enslave them. So I want to show you that process and who was involved and how long the Hyksos was there, where that fits into the biblical narrative. So during the 12th and 19th centuries BC, the so-called Amorite dynasties in Mesopotamia had set the stage for constant interchange of ideas, knowledge, and political protocol. International relations were extensive, so lots of contact. General prosperity prevailed, but while the 12th dynasty of Egypt expanded during this time, the second intermediate period that followed was one of serious decline and instability in Egypt, during which the Semitic Hyksos of the 15th dynasty ruled over the Nile Delta and the connected areas. Though the Hyksos pharaohs were themselves Asiatic Semites. So that's important for this narrative to understand that these are Semitic people that come in and making the high appointment of the Semitic Joseph entirely reasonable. So if we match up that story of Joseph and his time frame, this is a time period where Semites are in control of the land of Egypt. So for them to accept Joseph is totally a reasonable idea. If you had ethnic Egyptians, that's a much more challenging thing to accept. So such an appointment during the previous Middle Kingdom would be problematic, likewise in the following New Kingdom, that was explicitly anti-Semitic and anti-Asiatic, and the Semitic Hyksos, who took control of Lower Egypt during the Middle Bronze Age too, the 14th and 15th dynasties, are a perfect fit for the Joseph story for another reason. The Hyksos introduced the horse and chariot into Egypt. So you had a people group that probably came from the direction of modern-day Turkey, and they brought probably a couple things beyond the horse and chariot. They probably also brought something just as important, which was the fast wheel for making pottery. So something that spins around a little faster. It makes a different kind of pottery. It makes it easier to produce and reproduce replicate the same kind of pottery over and over and over. But before this time period, these don't exist in Egypt. The Hyksos bring those in. That's probably one of the reasons they were able to displace the ethnic Egyptians and take over. So while Asiatics had dominated the Nile Delta region during the Hyksos period, the Semitic regime of the Lower Egypt that had embraced Joseph and his relatives, their rule came to a sudden end about 1550 BC. At that time, Ahmose, founder of Egypt's 18th dynasty and ruling from Thebes in Upper Egypt, overthrew the Hyksos and drove their surviving military from Lower Egypt back into Canaan, thereby unifying the Black Lands, Egypt's name for itself, for the first time in more than 2 centuries. So the Hyksos were there for quite some time. The exploits of the native Egyptians, led by Pharaoh Ahmose, against the hated Hyksos, set the stage for the Thutmose dynasty, which is the 18th dynasty, as a reaction against the Hyksos debacle, but possibly they called it, allowing Semites to rule Egypt, which was a problem. Ahmose set in motion a policy of hatred against the Asiatic Semites and enslavement of those Semites, a policy that would last for the dynasty until the dynasty collapsed in the 14th century BC. So that becomes the policy. We now hate Semites, so we deal with them differently. So the most common date for the Exodus among people who take the Bible seriously is 1446. Maybe just to pause for a second, those who take the Bible less seriously take a later date and use Ramesses II. But I'll get into that. But it's a much later date, so it's a problem. So the arguments for the 1446 BC date of the Exodus is primarily based on a biblical chronology and supported by some archaeological evidence. The key points of the argument and evidence are as follows. Comes from biblical chronology based on 1 Kings 6:1, and the verse is the central part of this argument for 1446, and it states that Solomon began building the temple in Jerusalem in the 4th year of his reign, which is generally dated to 966, and that this occurred 480 years after the Exodus. So then you get the simple math. You back up into 1446 BC. From there, you can deduce that the conquest of land would then begin 40 years later in 1406. You also have some other places. Judges 11:26, the first mentions that Israel had been living in the land for about 300 years by the time of Jephthah, who was typically dated to around 1100 BC. And then you have 1 Corinthians 6. The general genealogical records provide a list of generations from that of Moses to the time of Solomon. So you put those numbers together as well. So it takes a very literal approach to those numbers. So also archaeological evidence. Jericho, for example, dates to around 1400 BC, as does Ai and Hazor. So if you take the number of a conquest land around 1406, that fits perfectly nicely. So some reject this idea. The proponents of the 1446 date reject the 13th century dating, which is based on the assumption that the Israelites were involved in the building of the city of Ramesses, because the name appears in Exodus 1:11 under Pharaoh Ramesses II. So the 1446 BC proponents argue that the name Ramesses in Exodus 1:11 is a later editorial update, replacing an earlier name for the location, rather than evidence of the Exodus happening in the time of Ramesses II. And this is one of those things that just happens. When you're pointing out a name of your city, you don't use the old name for it. Use the modern name, contemporary name that people are going to understand and know. It's not. I don't find that as being that big a deal. Certainly not enough to use that late date. They also point out that archaeological evidence does not support 13th century destruction of Jericho or other cities. So here's one of the things that happens in archaeology is many archaeologists are steeped in higher criticism. They generally have very little biblical knowledge. They've never been forced to really examine the biblical text. So they sort of just put it aside, and they'll come to it based on higher criticism, which questions the date and authorship and historical authenticity of Scripture all through, but especially in the Torah. And as they question those things, they make the assumption that it was written in a later date than it was actually written, and they assume it was written afterwards. So a lot of these people will come to it and say it was written in the time of David or later, or is even written in the time of David would be 1000 BC. Some will even say it was written after the Babylonian captivity for Jews to then make up a history and make up an ancient antiquity that shows them in that land, and therefore they've just made up this whole religion. It's completely untenable. And here's the biggest nail in the coffin of that higher criticism theory. If you take the Torah and much of the Old Testament, but Torah specifically, it is a Bronze Age document. Archaeology kills higher criticism. So higher criticism looks at it as like it was written later, but it should then not do a good job of representing Bronze Age ideas. But if you look at Torah, for example, and you look at the Abrahamic covenant, that's very Bronze Age. Someone writing in the Iron Age would not write it that way. They wouldn't have any knowledge about Bronze Age covenants. So you would expect to have historical anachronisms. So that would be a historical fact out of place. So hopefully that makes sense. They would write it like an Iron Age, someone in 1000 BC, not 2000 BC. That 1,000-year gap, they can't breach that. So totally wipes out higher criticism. But these people continue to think that way. So what they'll do, they'll come to, say, a city like Jericho, and they'll look at the archaeology and they'll say, this can't be related to the Exodus because I know I know best. The Exodus happened in, say, in the 1200s, and there's no archaeology. There's no physical remains here in the 1200s. So there was no Exodus. Well, if they looked back to the 1400s, say 1406 earlier, what happens is all of a sudden they go, oh, there is archaeology there, but they can't put the two things together because of their own bias against the Bible. Okay, my rant's done. Continuing on. The conclusion, the argument for 1446 BC Exodus date. Let me get rid of this if I can. Hinges on taking the biblical chronology literally, particularly for the 480 years mentioned in 1 Kings 6:1. And it's supported by the archaeology, and we've talked about the rest. We can dismiss Ramesses, even if you watched... I just forgot the name of the if you watch The Prince of Egypt, it has Ramesses as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It ain't right. It's not Ramesses. It's one of these other guys. Okay, so there is one other alternative, and that's the idea of putting together cultural synchronism. So that's looking at the past, studying things that we know about the past, and we look for at what point in history was there a decline in Egypt, and then you can put a whole bunch of historical aspects to that specifically that would relate to a nation that just experienced 10 plagues and the destruction of its major armies and a change from one king to the next suddenly and unexpectedly. So the identification, it's another way. So if you do that, and this is described in the Harvest Handbook of Bible Lands. So Dr. Collins is one who proposes this. So he kind of fits somewhere in the middle. The identification of the Pharaoh of the Exodus remains a highly debated issue, with various Egyptian kings suggested as candidates. Scholars have named Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, all in the 18th dynasty, and then some represent Ramesses II of the 19th dynasty as possible contenders. The disagreement arises due to differences in biblical and Egyptian chronologies, leading to a wide range of potential dates for the Exodus from the mid-15th century to the 13th century. The traditional approach, matching the favorite chronologies from the Bible in Egypt, has been criticized. It's just not academically rigorous. So if you take looking for a dynastic collapse during the proposed time frame, they find that while no significant collapse occurred at the end of the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, or Ramesses, Thutmose IV's reign marked the beginning of a decline that eventually led to the fall of the 18th dynasty. This period suggests aligns with the biblical account of the Exodus. So that moves it off of the 1446 date closer to like the 1420 date. So we're about 20 years difference. So to me, it's not a huge thing. I'm not sure all of our math from those calculations are completely correct anyways, and some of those numbers are debated. So I'm comfortable going, it's somewhere in here, and if the synchronisms fit Thutmose IV best, then I'm okay leaning that direction cautiously. So within this, one of the conclusions we can come to is this idea of centrality of Israel. So ancient Israel's geographical centrality in the ancient Near East rendered in its perennial battleground for warring empires and dynasties accentuating its strategic significance, situated at the crossroads of the major trade routes between Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia. Israel occupied a pivotal location that facilitated the movement of goods and armies. This position made it a coveted prize for powerful neighboring states such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, each seeking to control the crucial corridors to enhance their economic and military dominance. So this is something you're going to see play out time and time again. One of the examples we're going to look at later is when we get to the Hellenistic period. Antiochus Epiphanes, headed cruising down to Egypt to try to snag some gold, is stopped actually by a Roman general and draws a line in the sand. Actually, the line in the sand is a circle around Antiochus. And there's this demand: you either tell me you're about to head home or we're going to do battle, but don't step across the line in the sand until you've given me an answer. So Antiochus doesn't want to mess with the big boys from Rome, so he heads home. On the way home, he stops off in Israel and causes some trouble there, which we'll look forward to discussing that in the future. So in addition to the account of that I just gave you, the brief summary of Antiochus and the Romans, I want to give you another biblical example of the importance of that area of the Levant. So it's the Battle of Megiddo, about 605. So, and the Bible says in 1 Chronicles, after all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. So you have the situation where Josiah's at home. He's doing normal stuff, looks out the window, and he sees his buddy Necho has an army in his backyard, and he wants to know what's going on. This is be concerning. So he goes out against him, but he, meaning Necho, sent messengers to him saying, "What have I to do with you, king of Egypt? Have you not come against? I have not come out against you this day, but against the house with which I have war. For God commanded me," Elohim, that's what he uses there, "God commanded me to make haste, refrain from meddling with God." He tells him, refrain from meddling with God, who is with me, lest he, God, destroy you, Josiah. Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself so that he might fight with him, and ends up getting killed. Okay, so there's more details, though, in 2 Kings. And I'm going to start in 29. In his day, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went to the aid of the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went against him, and Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo when he confronted him. So, same account, but it gives you one interesting detail. Necho is headed out to help specifically the Assyrians. Now, who are the Assyrians doing battle with? The Assyrians are doing battle with Babylon. Babylon's to come against Assyria. And what this will set the stage for is Necho doesn't make it in time to help the Assyrians. The Babylonians are able to crush Nineveh and sack Nineveh. And when that takes place, Babylon becomes the superior superpower, because then they turn against the Egyptians and send them packing. And this sets the stage then for Nebuchadnezzar to take over and come and, among other things, take over the land of Judah. So here's where Megiddo is. This is where this takes place, north of Jerusalem. And you can remember back to this map, if they're doing battle here, Egypt's down here. They were headed up here to Carchemish. So they're cruising north. They get stopped right here, and then they are not able to make it in time to save the Assyrians. That leads the Babylonians to come turn. They're headed towards Egypt. As they're headed towards Egypt, they stop off and say, hey, we happen to know that Israel has a bunch of treasure. Let's start this Babylonian captivity in 605. Of course, that takes place in 3 stages. 605, that's when Daniel was taken. 597, that's when Ezekiel was taken, because in Judea people are causing a rebellious, so they come back in and take some more people there. So Ezekiel's captured and taken back to Babylon. And in 586, you have the final incursion by the Babylonians. Babylonians come in and sack the temple, destroy the city walls, and everything changes in Israel. It's not for 70 years from that first incursion that Jews start to return after Cyrus goes into Babylon, captures it, and releases the Jews for the people to start going back to their land, as recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah. So that Battle of Megiddo. So when we look at that, okay, so here is the Battle of Megiddo. We have another battle. So Battle of Megiddo, 1918. General Allenby, and there was the earlier Battle of Megiddo is between Thutmose, Necho II. And there's an interesting correlation here. So Eric Klein, in his article in Pharaoh's Footsteps, you can find it online, draws parallels between the military campaign of Pharaoh, Thutmose III, in 1479 BC. So this battle is recorded in a book that was published in the early 1900s. General Allenby had access to that. And as the story goes, General Allenby had read that, and he's a general for the Allies in World War I in the Middle East. So he's battling against the Ottoman Turks, and there's a situation where everyone's headed to Megiddo. And as they're headed to Megiddo, I believe Ottomans take this northern pass, and Allenby knew that Thutmose, in order to win his battle, took this middle passage. And he took this passage and he pulled off the maneuver, basically head him off at the pass. He got around him and was able to capture Megiddo. And this essentially turns the tide of World War I, at least as it relates to the Ottoman Turks in the Middle East, forces them to come to the point of negotiation and changes the outcome of World War I, or at least potentially. Okay, so I just wanted to show you these things, the interconnectedness of multiple peoples. You see Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and Israel all having this interconnected relationship. So having treaties, having enemies, and Israel right in the middle of all of that. And that was true back then, is true in the early 1900s, and is true today. So another people group that's important for us to understand is the Philistines. The biblical Philistines were a people described in the Hebrew Bible as living in the coastal regions of Canaan, primarily what's now known as Gaza, during the time of the Israelite judges and early Israelite monarchy. They're depicted as one of Israel's primary enemies. It's definitely true. So their origins is interesting because they're believed to have been part of the Sea Peoples, a group of maritime raiders from the Aegean region, or Anatolia, who settled along the eastern Mediterranean coast. So I think they're the Sea People, except the ones that come from Anatolia, maybe on foot. Some scholars suggest that they're originally from the island of Crete or elsewhere in the Aegean world, based on connections between their culture and that of the Mycenaean Greeks. So later on, we'll get to Mycenaeans and Minoans and get a better understanding of those two cultures. So the Sea People, or Philistines, settled in 5 major cities: that Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. You probably know Gath as the place where Goliath was. Many conflicts with Israel. We see those in the stories of Samson. Of course, David and Goliath, one of the most important ones, and Saul's final battle. So they have their own distinct culture and religion that really becomes more and more Canaanite-like as we go through their history, but they had gods like Dagon and Baal-zebub, relationships with other people. They were in contact with basically everyone, including Egyptians, Canaanites, Phoenicians, who are seafaring people. And in more recent history, there have been DNA studies of Philistine burial sites to demonstrate that the Philistines were Greeks. And that's somewhat important to today. One of the reasons we study history is to understand things of today. So if there are no Philistines, Palestinians, or if they're not even from that region, they're not from the Near East, they're from Crete, it makes it really hard for the modern day Palestinians to make a case that they have a historical precedent before Israel of ownership of that land. There's lots of reasons to reject that idea. So who are the modern day Palestinians? Modern day Palestinians are simply displaced Arab people, and they were displaced during the late World War II. And they're really displaced because once Israel becomes a state, what happens is anyone who didn't want to be part of Israel could leave, but those other Arab populations refused to take in those refugees, preferring to use them as pawns and leave them stranded in a specific region. The reason there is a city in Gaza and a nation, is Israel gave them that piece of property in exchange for peace. It hasn't worked out very well for Israel, but that is what was supposed to have happened. Okay, let's look at some language stuff. Here's the Rosetta Stone, one of my wife's photos from the British Museum. It was discovered in 1799 by French soldiers during Napoleon's military campaign in Egypt. It was found in the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta. And French engineers were working on fortifications, and one officer noticed the stone, realizes this could be important. Let's grab it. They do that. Here it is with their sign in the British Museum. So the importance of the Rosetta Stone. Because it has 3 languages, it provides specific opportunities. So it has Egyptian hieroglyphs. That's a formal script used for religious texts. It has Demotic, which is like a simplified cursive form of Egyptian writing. And it had ancient Greek, which we understood. So using ancient Greek, we could back into the Demotic and ancient hieroglyph languages. It's because of the Rosetta Stone that we're now able to understand and translate those languages. So, talked about deciphering, the significance. So what it did, it opened up the entire field of Egyptology by enabling scholars to read and understand ancient Egyptian texts. So reveals a whole bunch about culture, religion, governance, history that we didn't have before. So another language is Akkadian. So early discoveries, cuneiform script. So that is the script. Akkadian is the language. Was written in cuneiform. So they take clay tablets. They use a wedge, and in this wedge they just press down to make their letters. It's used for various languages in Mesopotamia, which the main one being Akkadian, and European explorers and diplomats began discovering cuneiform inscriptions in the Middle East, especially at sites like Nineveh and Babylon in the 18th century, AD, of course. Inscriptions, large collection of tablets and inscriptions, particularly those that are discovered by Henry Rawlinson in modern-day Iran, played a key role. So it tells us about the Elamites and the Akkadians, and it's just a critical piece in the puzzle. So major figures, just to point out, a German scholar, first guy here, George. He's a German scholar who made early progress in the deciphering of Old Persian cuneiform and had similarities with Akkadian. So through his work was focused on Old Persian. It sort of lays this foundation to be able to properly translate Akkadian. So here we have Henry Rawlinson. He's a British Army officer and scholar. His work on these inscriptions, which included the Akkadian script, was crucial. By comparing the Akkadian version with the Old Persian and Elamite versions, he made headway in understanding Akkadian cuneiform, and his contributions were pivotal. So other scholars contributed to deciphering. They began to get into analyzing grammar and just had greater understanding. We're not too worried about this. Just to understand, so it begins as a pretty complex language, and gradually gets simplified as they go. They learn how to use alphabets and shrink it down to phonetics. So finally, by the mid-19th century, a combination of linguistic comparison, analysis, grammar, and translation of parallel texts allowed scholars to fully decipher Akkadian. They could read not only royal inscriptions, but also administrative records, legal texts, and literary works, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, one that we've talked about already. So another important document, the Amarna letters, are a collection of clay tablets from the 14th century BC, and they were discovered in ruins. The letters consist of correspondence between the Egyptians and administration, various Near Eastern rulers. Their collection, like I said, in clay tablets, they open up the door to understanding interaction from Egyptian administrations to all these other nations, and things like gift giving, demanding military support, diplomatic relations was really important. And one of the amusing interactions is a set of letters going back and forth between. This would have been in the time period in the decline of Egypt, and it shows one nation asking Egypt for gold and saying things like, you have gold, you just go out and gather it up. Gold is like dust in your land. And they had hoped the Egyptians would respond with, yeah, we'll send you that. And rather they send them gift baskets instead of gold coins. So it becomes a fight among the two. But it's a very polite, because you want to be polite with the person you're asking for a fortune. Demonstrates elements of society and economy. So trade, marriage alliances, gift exchanges, and like we mentioned, demand for military assistance. And finally, incite the Egyptian rule. The letters from vassal kings in Canaan and Syria often express concerns about local threats. And that's so they'll write letters saying there's a threat here, there's a problem, we need help, or we need money. It also has letters identifying people like Akhenaten and Amenhotep III. So we see them in these correspondences. So I want to talk about chronology a little bit more. So ancient Egyptian Kings List, really what I want to talk about are the sources that we have. So one of the sources is definitely the Amarna letters. Those have been super important for us. But we have things like the Turin Kings List, and there's basically 3 different lists. What we'll see multiple times is these lists have part of their mythology, so they go way back, and you'll see kings that ruled for 30,000 years. Then as they get closer to their own time period, they become more realistic. So some ancient Egyptian kings list, like the Turin list, and they count by Manetho, so we'll talk about him in a second, contain exaggerated reign length, especially for the early dynasties, while exact ages of individual rulers aren't always specified. The reigns of some early kings are implausibly long, often hundreds of years, or thousands, or tens of thousands. So, Manetho Kings List. This is the one that everyone goes to and says this is the most important, most accurate list that we have. I question a lot of this, but Manetho, he's an Egyptian historian from the Ptolemaic period or Hellenistic period, reported that the early kings of Egypt reigned for incredibly long periods. In his work, some kings are said to have ruled for several centuries, suggesting either exaggerated range or symbolic numbers. For example, Menes, the legendary first king of the unified Egypt around 3100 BC, is said to have ruled for over 60 years, according to Manetho. So it's not implausible, but it is unlikely. Turin Kings List has some of the same details, and detailed document from the New Kingdom records the reigns of early mythical kings, particularly from the first dynasty in pre-dynastic Egypt. It lists reigns ranging from 25 to 100 years for early kings. There's also a section of the Turin King List that mentions mythical kings or god kings before the start of human kingship. And these guys supposedly reigned for thousands of years, sometimes up to 30,000 years. So, just mention this one. The god Ptah, for example, was said to have ruled Egypt for 9,000 years before human pharaohs, followed by other gods, demigods, and spirits who ruled for thousands of years each. So these extreme reign lengths are clearly symbolic and intended to emphasize the divine or eternal nature of early kings or gods. Okay, so with all that, One of our key thoughts is the idea of Mediterranean, frogs around the pond, interconnectiveness with Israel, not always, but oftentimes in the center of connectedness. It's my thought that one of the primary means of this interconnective nature of the Mediterranean is simply through trade, and that especially of ship travel. And there's two terms I want you to see here, which is, this is the term for ships of the ancient Mediterranean that stopped at multiple harbors and sailed within sight of land is cabotage. The practice involved navigating along the coast rather than going out in open sea. So they were always within sight of the coast, and therefore they could look out there and see whenever they come along the port. Traders would be on these ships, or sometimes just goods. The owner of the ship would be the trader himself. So what would happen is you'd have these ships that were trade ships, and they were tramping. And that refers to the practice of ships operating without a fixed schedule, but essentially they're going from port to port to port to trade goods, as they would trade goods and they could go back to a previous port, but they had flexible schedules in the purpose of doing trade. So I think that's one of the primary means that the frogs around the pond idea works, to connect cultures and societies. We see technology moving very quickly. Once someone gets a new pottery style, that moves really fast into everyone else's ecosystem. So you can see that in the archaeology. So as we go forward, I want you to continue to consider the connectedness of the Mediterranean and how that works out in the future and how it came into being. And as we move into next week and coming weeks, Greek and Roman cultures, how this continues to play a part in the study of Mediterranean. So with that, I hope your studies continue to be a blessing. I hope this lecture helped. If I can do anything for you, please contact me. In the meantime, I'll see you shortly, and God bless in the meantime.